Hello. Okay. So I'm just going to plunge right in. In the West, we often hear about Iran in militaristic terms, of course. Its nuclear program, missile program, and so on. Its ambitions in the region. But anyone who's been to Iran here? Okay, yes. Sees the significance, instantly sort of senses the significance of culture in general, music, poetry, film, and so on. And in fact, I argue that you can't really understand modern Iran without understanding its music. Music carries so much meaning, certain songs carry so much meaning that it's really hard to understand modern Iran without understanding a song like Morgh Sahar, which I will play a segment of, or Yar Dabistani Man, or Maro Bebous, and so on, songs that most of you won't know, so I won't go on talking about them. The reason I chose to work on music is rooted in my own childhood experiences growing up in Iran in the 1980s, during which this is the first decade after the revolution. So there's a huge break, as you all know, through Professor Afari's course. I've been told that you will be getting there, but you will find out, and some of you already know, that it was a huge break from the sort of monarchist Pahlavi Iran to an Islamic revolution and an Islamic republic. And growing up as a child there in the 80s, it was impossible not to sense that music was both important but also problematic. Our lives were permeated with music, so the birthday parties, the car rides, music was everywhere, and it continued sort of streaming in from LA, where Iran's very important and huge and very vibrant pop music industry transplanted itself to after the revolution. And also Western music and so on continued streaming in. But there was also a lot of terror associated with music. So ahead of checkpoints on the roads, you had to turn down the music, hide the music tapes. Birthday parties, you had to be very careful lest the comité, the sort of minders, would come in and stop the party and worse. And of course, I have very vivid memories of being taken along as a sort of camouflage with my uncles on trips to buy music tapes from the black market. When I returned again to Iran in 1996, still a teenager, we left Iran when I was about 10, returned after high school in Germany. I couldn't believe when I saw a grand piano at the swimming pool where my parents took me for dinner. There was a swimming pool at this hotel, Hotel Hyatt, now called Azadi. There was a man sitting at the piano playing classical Persian music. It was stunning because music in the public realm was completely inconceivable during my childhood in the 80s in Iran. So something quite important had already changed, and there was already a lot more sort of ease in the public realm. But people wouldn't clap after the man was done with playing his pieces on the piano. So the public expression of joy by means of clapping was still off the menu. So a little bit of ease, but still great restrictions. So this love of music, joy, and fun, which is all that I remember of my childhood, aside from bombings and so on, of course. But my childhood still, in those conditions, was still permeated with all of that joy. That was, of course, at odds with the new revolutionary state's disciplinary harshness in its attempts to create this Islamic polity, right? It wasn't just a political project, it was a project to change Iranians as a society, or Iran as a society. So on the one hand, official authorities have tried and still try to control the space for music, and on the other hand, people consume and practice music with fervor. It was Hossein Alizadeh, one of the most famous Iranian musicians, who said that it is in part because of the Islamic Republic and because of the ban on music that you now have an instrument in every household, and people really practice it almost as a political gesture of kinds. So this tension throws open a very basic question: why is music so important? And it is with this question in mind that I trace a political history of music in post-revolutionary Iran. So my book does two things. On the one hand, it tells the story of these musicians who, despite and often against the given restrictions, created this channel of mass communication through music, at great cost to themselves sometimes, and oftentimes through a lot of hardship, but created this channel of mass communication that really transformed the culture within the limits of this authoritarian sort of state, and created a space where people could talk about certain things that they couldn't in the public realm: freedom, issues about gender, the role of religion, and so on. And on the other hand, my book tells the story of the evolution of the Islamic Republic itself. So how from the state that I described in the 1980s, Iran, the state eventually evolved to accommodate this growing youth bulge and increasingly allow more and more in the cultural sphere. A little about my methodology. My work is intensively interview-based. I've interviewed all of the people whom I write about in the book, from musicians to policymakers to audience members. It's ethnographic, so I took part in a lot of concerts and music practice sessions and music recording sessions and so on. And of course, I consulted whatever there was in the primary literature, biographies, memoirs, and the little that there is in secondary literature. So in talking about music's political significance, you really have to start with Mohammad Reza Shajarian. Shajarian is now 78, and he is the preeminent vocalist of Persian classical music. He, in fact, commented to me on music's importance. This was at the end of an interview that I had with him, and we talked about the role of the clerics, and he said, the clerics were just supposed to guide people. They weren't supposed to take over the reign of government. And that's kind of what we are here to do. We musicians also are here to guide people. And I said, well, so are you saying that clerics and musicians kind of, have the same role? And he said, yeah, they do. We just do it more beautifully through music. And so he really does see himself as, in his role as a musician, as someone who's there to guide people. And the role of music to guide in the political realm goes back to Iran's constitutional revolution, which you have covered by now, 1906 to 1911, when a poet and musician by the name of Arif Qazvini really turned the medium of the concert, the musical concert, and music itself around. So from just doing the golo bolbol, the flower, the rose, and the nightingale, he activated Persian poetry to have political content, and in fact turned the concert into a political medium. In the absence of other we now, of course, live in an age of mass media and everything. In the absence of those forms of media, it was the concert where people would come together, complete strangers, as they still do now, and come around a specific discourse and express their allegiance to whatever idea there was in this concert, or their opposition, right? It's that kind of space where you can express that. And Shajarian draws extensively on the works of Arif Qazvini and others from a century ago, so that by now there's this century-long tradition of reenacting those protest songs. So you have to imagine when Shajarian sings a song, something that I'm going to play for you in a bit, it's not just Shajarian in this moment of time. He's really referring to this century-long arc of Iranian desire and expression for greater freedoms. So, when we talk about political music, people often think about underground music, right? Rap, hip-hop, rock, that's where it's at. But actually, I would argue that in the Iranian case and context, it's really Persian classical music that has the greatest political potential, and the one with the largest auditory and communitarian participants, people who really partaken in this practice for many, many decades. Here's a painting that illustrates the Chavush Cultural and Artistic Society. Shajarian is the one under the lamp. This is right before the revolution. These people were, in fact, underground musicians before the revolution succeeded. They were creating some of the most potent songs that helped the revolution succeed. The man next to him, Mohammad Reza Lotfi. These are all sort of the key figures of Persian classical music into the revolution and after the revolution. So unlike rock and rap, which smacked of modernism and the West toxification, which you guys will talk about, that the revolutionaries tried to eliminate sort of from this pure society, Persian classical music had that revolutionary capital still. It had maintained that nativist revolutionary capital. Still, for most of the decade after the revolution, the government banned all musical performances. So live musical performances were banned a couple of years into the revolution. And Shajari, and even sort of performers of Persian classical music, Shajarian and his Çavuş group and others like them, they weren't able to give concerts except for in spaces like foreign embassies or spaces of religious minorities, because those are outside of the jurisdiction of the Islamic Republic. So the state couldn't barge into there and stop what was happening. So there were a few concerts sort of in foreign embassies, but after the war, Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988. After the war in 1991 was the first time that Shajarian, and he was the first musician who was given a permit to give a live concert. In 1991, he had his first set of concerts. And at that concert, he performed this song, which is composed by the Jewish musician Morteza Ney Davoud. The song is from Malik al-Shu'ara Bahar from about the 1920s. He performed this song, and since then, at every concert that he's given, whether in Iran or abroad, people ask him to perform it at the end of each concert. So it's become a ritual of protest. People ask for the song. Shajarian agrees to sing this song, and people really sort of partake in the performance of this song. You see the text of the song here: bird of dawn, start your lament, refresh my anguish, break this cage with your scintillating sighs and turn it upside down. Wing-tied nightingale, emerge from the cage corner, compose the song of freedom for humankind. And with your breath, fill the arena of this people's land with sparks. The cruelty of the oppressor, the callousness of the hunter have destroyed my nest. And people really sort of sing along with this. And I want to just show you guys an excerpt of the song to see the performativity of the song, right? Shajarian starting the song and people applauding and welcoming even just the first tones, realizing what's about to come. And I hope the volume will... So people kind of flood the stage, right? They come to the stage, they stand there. I can't show you the whole clip, but it's online. This is from a concert in 2007. People have tears streaming down their faces. They're singing along with this song of the caged bird breaking free. And I might just stop it right there. It's worth mentioning that Shajarian still lives in Iran, but the government hasn't given him a permit to perform since 2009. That's when the Green Movement happened, which you will cover in Professor Afari's class. That was the greatest shock to the system since 1979, since the revolution. 30 years into the revolution, there's a green uprising, millions of people on the streets protested, and Shajarian was very vocal, and since then he's been banned from giving public concerts, but he was given permits to have albums. So the political potential of the concert is very well understood by state authorities. Releasing albums is okay, but concerts have not been, and unfortunately he's been quite sick with cancer for a few years now, and it appears that the government ultimately stopped him from giving concerts in Iran since 2009, and now he's sick and may not have the chance to give another concert anytime soon. Now I'm going to do a big jump forward to Persian hip-hop. Rap Farsi, for a long time, was the most popular genre of music with Iran's youngest. And this is the generation that came after the generation of sort of, I don't know how many among you know some Iranian musicians, but Mohsen Namju and so on, whose gripe was really with the ideological superstructure of the Islamic Republic, who really rebelled against that in their music. Somebody like Surush Lashkari, also known as Hichkas, who's generally regarded as the godfather of Persian hip-hop because he started the website that helped people actually post their songs up there and wrote sort of tutorials for people how to actually write rap songs and so on. So Hijkes, the godfather of Persian rap, is a good representative of the post-9/11 generation. Their gripe was really more sort of more global. They were being attacked on two fronts: by their own government in the lack of opportunities that existed for them as young men trying to overcome this phase of adolescence and actually succeed into sort of adulthood and having the opportunities and economic means to do so. So the lack of opportunities and the kinds of restrictions that the state imposes on them and ultimately infantilizes them with. And on the other hand, of course, George W. Bush's America, where Afghanistan was attacked, and ultimately Iraq was also attacked, and Iran for many years was under the threat of attack, and it appears under Trump is now again. So Hijkes draws on anxieties about the nations and notions of masculinity and offers a sort of compensatory emphasis on gender, right? In the face of this powerlessness, he really doubles down on his manhood, and that's something that you really see in his lyrics and his music, and he creates this parallel gang or almost nation to the official nation by singing songs about his gang as the soldiers on the streets, the ones who are going to ultimately hold up Iran's flag, because implicitly the Islamic Republic is no longer fit to hold up that flag and that honor. So he also employs a lot of the ethic of Javan Mardi and so on. So it's all about sort of chivalry and the excellence of character and strength and manhood and so on. I will play you an excerpt of Hijkes' song, and I think that a lot of the discourses in Hijkes' songs really foretold the protests that happened toward the end of 2017 and early 2018, when there were mass protests all over Iran. The discourses in Rap Farsi about the sort of inequalities and the corruption and all of that really foretold them. And I think one track in particular called Ikhtilaf, which has a sort of double entendre, discord and inequality, so discord that arises from inequality, is a sort of prime example of that kind of work. So here we go. This is from the movie No One Knows About Persian Cats. So the film director took one of Hijkes' songs and laid it out in video. I don't think you can see the subtitles. Can you? Oh, you have a screen there. Okay. Eat or be eaten. Half the people are, the class struggle is oppressive. It saps people's spirits. So he's calling God to basically come down and talk to him, and he calls himself garbage. He says, come down and talk to me right now, because this is not okay, and if you're there, then we need to have a conversation. This really spoke to, and I want to mention that, Hijkes' work, even though it's rap, and sort of in the West, we conceive of rap being consumed by the younger generation. In Iran, actually, Hijkes', that is the case, but Hijkes' work, for example, in Ikhtilaf, the track that I showed, was well known across generations, because it was a song that was that really resonated with people, and people knew about it. I went to a celebration for Imam Mahdi in 2011 in like a public park in Tehran, and they had this contest where men were to come on stage and perform a segment of a song, and then the audience was supposed to clap on and through their applause express which of these men had won. And one of the men, so they'd all sort of lined up, and one of the men took the microphone and he said, Inja Tehran, which is the first line of the song, this year is Tehran, and his microphone was instantly cut off. So not only did people know the song, but the authorities regulating the celebration also knew the song and didn't want it to be performed publicly. So, okay, Shajarian and Hichkas are two examples of powerful music and cross-generational music. But if you were to go to a concert in Iran today, you would most likely end up in a pop concert that will move you into dancing. They're all very sort of dance pop, in the rhythms. But it certainly won't tickle your political antennas. One of the most dramatic developments that happened in post-revolutionary Iran was the revival of pop music after nearly 2 decades. So for 2 decades, this pop music scene that I mentioned previously, which transplanted itself into LA, not far from here, which is why it has the honorific title of Tehrangeles, right? Huge community, huge pop empire. For 2 decades, pop music was banned in Iran. So one of the things I try to examine in my book, though it's a very small section of the book, but I think it's an interesting process to sort of that illustrates a lot of things about how the government works and how policy is made. One of the things that happened is that all of a sudden pop music was green-lighted. So I tried to figure out how this happened, considering that in the first months after the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini had very strong views about music. In a speech to Radio Darya at the Caspian, only a few months into the revolution, he had said, if you want your country to be a righteous country, a free country, an independent country, transform radio and television into educational tools. Eliminate music. Music is treachery to the country. It is the betrayal of our youth. Eliminate music completely. Right? It couldn't be sort of more explicit, and it couldn't be any clearer. And in fact, once radio was taken over by the revolutionaries, the first song that was officially broadcast from state radio was this song, Iran Iran, sung by Reza Ruigari, which really embodied the perfect ideal of the revolutionaries. It puts together Iran and Islam in equal parts, and you will hear it in the song. The lyrics are not too, sort of vast, or they're quite sort of limited and succinct. It's Iran, 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 Allah, 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 and I'm going to play you a short segment of it. Just so you get a sense for this march-like music, no instruments, right? Choir, march, that was the ideal. So that was the ideal, it wasn't contained within Khomeini's understanding or definition of music, so this was the kind of music that was allowed. But things really took a turn when one of Khomeini's dearest proteges, Ayatollah Mortaza Motahhari, was assassinated, also in the summer of, sort of in the early fall of 1979, so the same year of the revolution. And for the commemoration of his passing, sort of a year into his death, musicians at state television produced a song that was a bit more rhythmical and was actually based in the Persian classical system of the radif. And so they weren't sure this would be okay and wanted to test the waters, and took the piece to Khomeini himself. So Imam Khomeini listens to this piece and he says, I want to see the makers of the piece. In their presence, he says, I don't cry much, but I cried when I heard your song. This song is the most beautiful kind of music that I've ever heard, and if you continue like this, I will support you. So with that, really, in one sort of, instance and personal sort of interaction and event, really, the edict on music was overturned. Now, it wasn't just any kind of music was forbidden. Music that was committed to the ideals of the revolution, even if it was rhythmical, was actually okay. It was, from that point onward, more music like the song that they created in honor of Shahid Motahhari, which I'm going to play for you, were allowed. But I want to give you a sense for the kind of sensitivity around music at the time. At a music festival panel that I attended in 2000 and also in 2011, a sociologist at Tehran University, Azam Rawadrat, she told me this story. She said, we were on a road trip with my friends. We were just about 20 of us. We were really depsh. These are like hardcore revolutionaries, hardcore Hezbollahis, tight chadors and really in with the idea and ready to die for it. And she said, we made a stop for lunch somewhere, and this track came on state television. And one of my friends felt such social responsibility that she just jumped and turned the television off. Even though it was on state television, she thought it couldn't be, it must be a mistake. They can't possibly have music on state television. But subsequently, Khomeini's view on this song, and more generally about music, by the way, the notion of committed art, of course, is a communist one, but it was sort of very well sort of integrated into the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Subsequently, that was allowed, and I'll show you. And you're going to laugh now because, of course, it's not in any way sort of, but it is rhythmical and very different from Iran, 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 which you just heard. Okay, I hope that suffices in terms of just giving you a sense for it. You can look all of these clips up online. So how do we explain this? How do we reconcile this with Khomeini's statement only a year earlier that all music was to be eliminated? Khomeini, when he was talking about music, this aging cleric, what he meant was that sort of pop music scene where, women and men mingled, alcohol was consumed, there was dancing, and so on. But his jurisprudence on music actually was completely sort of in alignment with his statement that this kind of music was to be permitted, because his jurisprudence is based in the philosophy of an Islamic scholar, philosopher of 1,000 years ago, Al-Ghazali, who had said that basically the rule about music is the heart, the reflection of the heart. So if your heart is bad and has bad intentions, music will, or a certain kind of music could create bad intentions and have a bad effect. If your heart is good and pure, that music won't have that kind of reflection. So basically what it comes down to is twofold. His response was twofold. One, the listener can decide him or herself what kind of music has that kind of bad effect on them. Two, Khomeini was famously very succinct. He was asked in a written sort of questionnaire, and he said, Orfiast, it depends on convention. So convention can decide what kind of music is problematic and what isn't. Both of those edicts on music are, of course, problematic, because within the Islamic superstructure of the Islamic Republic, where music is highly regulated, it isn't left up to each listener for themselves to decide what kind of music they can and cannot listen to. Music is highly regulated. And conventions can't be arrived at completely freely, because everything is within this sort of Islamic superstructure. And in a public speech, Khomeini's son sort of retold years later, this conversation took place between Akbar Rafsanjani, who was president at the time, and Imam Khomeini. Rafsanjani said to Khomeini, well, didn't you say music should be completely eliminated? What happened? How come you changed your opinion on that? And Khomeini said, let us assume that the music in question was broadcast by the radio of Saudi Arabia. Then I would forbid it, because wherever Taghut or Satan and idol worship is in power, opposition to what he undertakes is allowed, and such opposition conforms to expediency, is the right thing to do. But here, where the Islamic State is in power, a different form of regulation is valid. So some of you may be kind of stunned by that expression, by that statement. To Khomeini, the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and the kind of wealth that the Saudi royalty lived in and so on, he considered that not Islamic. He considered that to be this worst kind of system, and he had great opposition. So you would think he would say, within the US or, I don't know, France, but he's actually referring as the worst example to Saudi Arabia. Anyway, but this kind of decision making where the government's interests overrule other considerations, even considerations in the Sharia, became an established form of policymaking in the Islamic Republic, and has continued to be used in all kinds of realms. But basically what this policy of maslahat or expediency entails is that the survival of the state, the interest of the state, overrules even any edicts in the Sharia and of Islamic law. This is something that Khomeini himself has said verbatim. But Khomeini's response also left a lot of latitude for policymakers to wield over music. What kind of music is actually in the interest of the state, and what kind of music isn't, right? And it's precisely that kind of latitude that leads to a lot of frustration among musicians, because there aren't very clear policies on music. And so musicians over and over, and the expletive that you keep hearing is taklif موسیقی روشن نیست. Music is in limbo. We just don't know what's allowed, what's not allowed. But that kind of ambiguity also leads to opportunities for musicians to be able to push the envelope and get things past the censors that they would think you wouldn't be able to. So it kind of works in both ways, actually. And as one official commented to me, this ambiguity is really because they're more powerful ayatollahs than Khomeini, who have much stricter views on music than Khomeini once had or Khamenei does now. And it's just not worth it to, those powerful conservative ayatollahs are the sort of constituency, are the power, are the back of the system, right? You can't make them angry. And so it's just not worth it to take that kind of risk and allow for things that they wouldn't like. So, by the way, for example, to just give you an example of the kind of power that a powerful ayatollah, for example, can have, not too long ago for Persian New Year, Alam ul-Huda was this very conservative cleric in Mashhad, where the shrine of the holiest shrine, Shia shrine in Iran is, the shrine of the 8th Imam, Imam Reza. There was a celebration for Persian New Year in Tehran, not even in Mashhad. The city council put up this celebration. There were a few girls who did this very traditional dance, 7 or 8 years old. There were 3 or 4 of them on the stage. And subsequently, he published this statement where he said, this celebration was totally un-Islamic. It showed that these girls don't have the Prophet's the Prophet's daughter as their role models, but Sophia Loren. Now, who knows who Sophia Loren is? Yes, nobody knows who Sophia Loren is, okay? Sophia Loren is like a 90-year-old Italian actress who clearly was the heartthrob of, Alam ul-Huda's youth. But these girls don't know who Sophia Loren is. I mean, what kind of statement is that, right? He's literally from the Stone Age. Is totally like disconnected from reality and society and so on. And yet, that statement of his led to the resignation of the Tehran mayor, of the mayor of Tehran, of a city of 14 million people. The mayor had to resign because it was so damning on him that this celebration could take place. Subsequently, he was reinstated, but for a few weeks at least, he'd offered his resignation. Anyway. So within that context, how did it happen that pop music became green-lighted, right? How do we account for this, considering that nobody wants to take too many political risks? Now, there's still a lot of speculations about the re-legitimization of pop music in post-revolutionary Iran, and the basic understanding is, the basically sort of accepted narrative is that the Islamic Republic, powerless to control the flow of music from Los Angeles, from those depraved people, Iranians in LA who created this kind of content, decided very actively to nurture these young musicians who oftentimes had voices similar to the musicians in LA. So there was somebody who had a voice exactly like, Daryush, another person who had a voice exactly like Ebi, somebody else exactly like this other person. They're all male because women are not allowed to sing solo. But in doing research on this, I found that really the opposite was true. The way that pop music came back again was mostly through the efforts of several young musicians, the first graduates of the Music Academy, who wanted to make careers as musicians. They weren't ideological. They weren't in it for the politics. They wanted to become musicians. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing and kept getting rejections, sort of written rejections. In fact, the man who is really sort of to credit for the first pop album and the first pop song in post-revolutionary Iran, Khashar Etemadi, kept getting these slips back saying, rejected, his voice is too similar to Daryush, to, Khanandai Umbar Ab. And as far as state media were concerned, there was no group that schemed this, but something fortuitous did happen. There was one official who became the director of music in state television. He happened to have creative capital. He was a poet, so he was an artist. He also happened to have revolutionary capital. He was a friend of Ayatollah Khamenei, so he had real power and weight and say, and he could risk certain things. And in my conversation with the people involved in the process, I was told that Muallim basically convinced Khamenei that without homemade pop music, Iran's youth would be at greater risk of cultural invasion. The discourse of cultural invasion in the 1990s, Iran was huge. So the war was over. Now it was about keeping Iran's youth sort of safe from this Western cultural invasion. And Khamenei is then said to have quietly sought the approval of top Islamic scholars, and the rest is history. So after many, many years of rejection, finally, Khashayar Etemadi published this first album, quite appropriately called Delshure, Anxiety. And when you compare Etemadi to Daryush, it's not just the voice that's similar. Khashayar really trails Daryush's sort of mode of singing and the affect in his voice and so on. And but he also manages to create continuity with the march-like, choir-like songs of the ideal of the Islamic Republic. And so he creates continuity on both fronts, both with that the sentiment of that pop music before the revolution, but also staying within the framework of the regulations of the Islamic Republic. Etemadi's song Manu to Derakht o Barun, You and Me, Tree and Rain, is really the song that most people refer to when they talk about Iran's very first post-revolutionary pop song. And in the beginning, many who heard this song actually thought they were listening to Daryush. And in fact, Etemadi's own anecdote about his first time hearing his own song in public was that he was in a taxi and the song came on radio. The driver put his foot on the brake and just brought the car to a screeching halt and said, "Oh my God, Daryush is back. And everything's about to change. Iran's going to become a different place now." It was conceivable at the time. This is the beginning of the Khatami era. The reformists had this overwhelming victory. Their newspapers with a sort of very wide range of opinions were being published. So it was a whole different kind of Iran, and it was conceivable. Etemadi said, I kind of said, that's me. It's actually me. And the driver was like, shut up. Like, who are you to nutcase? But anyway, that's how similar the voices are. You don't know Daryush's voice, and I'm sorry, I won't have enough time to show you that, but I will show you Khashayar Etemadi's voice, and you can look up Daryush on YouTube if you're interested. He has a very melancholy voice. So this was very new. There are female vocals. There's a saxophone that comes in at one point. The poem is a poem of Ahmad Shamlu, a dissident poet. So on many fronts, this was quite sort of groundbreaking for the time. I'm going to stop it there because otherwise I won't get to the end of my talk. So the reason for the similarities in voice are kind of a bit more sort of accidental, and I can talk about it in the question and answers stage if you're interested. But basically what it had to do with was that these pre-revolutionary pop singers were the role models. Still continued to be the role models. In fact, when Khashayar Etemadi met Daryush, he said to him, I became a singer because of my love for your voice. On the official side, the man whom the singers themselves credit for, the guy who I mentioned, for enabling this revival at state television, Ali Muallim Damghani, had an intriguing response to my question. I asked him, I said, so you said, I said, a lot of people say you guys really planned this. You brought in singers with similar voices, and this is all a conspiracy. And he said, similarities in voice are accidental. This here is the mother country. Rivers flow into the ocean and not the other way around. There's no problem if the singers here are imitating their own past. This has nothing to do with Daryush or Khashayar. They had a past that they liked, and they are imitating that past. This is quite sort of radical too in some ways, right? Because in fact, Ali Muallim is breaking down a binary dichotomy that really governs all of our thinking about Iran. The 1979 revolution is the stark marker in Iranian history. Everything is before or after. But Ali Muallim is kind of, breaks down that sort of stark dichotomy and reclaims a past that the very same ideological system that he serves has rejected, right? And in doing so, he really gains authenticity for the musicians, agency and authenticity for the artists whom he promoted from within state television, at the cost of appearing to legitimize segments of that past. But he had the revolutionary capital to do that. And in fact, in the conversation with me, he kept, for him, Daryush and Khashayar Etemadi just kind of melded. In the conversation with me, he kept mixing them up. He kept attributing songs of Daryush to Etemadi and vice versa, and just got them completely mixed up. So somehow, in his mind, Daryush, who is this political singer before the revolution, he actually had gone to prison because he sang political songs against the Shah, but still was part of this pop scene and had to leave Iran and go into exile nevertheless. But he was a good example of that period, and so it was okay to continue that. And I don't go as far as saying that, and I don't put it on paper, but I do think that perhaps this whole thing wouldn't have happened if there wasn't the fortuitous sort of coincidence of Daryush and Khashayar Etemadi and Ali Muallim being in where he was at that particular moment in time. So anyway, subsequently a lot of pop albums were published. The first ones always had to sort of pretend that even when they were romantic and love songs that they were within sort of Islamic bounds. So Benyamin, one of the most famous pop singers, when he sang his song Memories, Khatiraha, where he closes his eyes and envisions a loved one, you still had to be able to justify that the loved one that you were envisioning was the Messiah, that this could fit within a religious framework. Now that's no longer the case. Pop musicians can sing about whatever they want. In fact, Benyamin, again himself, for example, has a song, Ashiq Shudam, I've fallen in love. And in it he says, if she finds out that I'm truly in love with her, she will no longer be interested in me, right? Meaning she's not interested in that kind of love. She's interested in a more physical, different kind. And that's okay. He's on stage singing that, right? And for those of you who've never been to a concert, has anyone here been to a pop concert in Iran? Okay. So for those of you who haven't been, this is what they look like. And I want you to see the audience. It's very sort of cross-generational, very mixed. I won't get too much into the music. This is one of the most popular ones now. But it's very sort of, fast rhythms, and people are practically dancing in their seats, and all of that is okay. Anyway, I'll stop it here. I'll be another 7 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. So, in fact, now it's really difficult to distinguish between the pop music in Iran, produced in Iran, and pop music produced in LA. There are a lot of collaborations. Producers here produce for musicians in Iran. Songwriters in Iran write for musicians there. So those kinds of red lines have been eliminated. But the uniqueness of the legitimation of pop music really speaks to its important place in society in the 60s and 70s, and really sort of has been a unique process, because when we look at other genres of music, it's been much more sort of touch and go and much more complicated for the government to figure out what to do. The prime example of such a genre is Persian rap. In 2007, the government initially, I think they thought they could completely kill Persian hip hop, and created a documentary, for example, called Shock, in which they portrayed members of this music scene as Satanists who, drink each other's blood and eat each other's feces. I mean, it was really just so crazy. it really did shock people because it was just so crazy that people sort of laughed at it. But it did affect an important segment of the population who knows really nothing much about this scene, as was ready to believe that this scene is evil and would perhaps do something about making sure that their children don't listen to Persian hip hop and the whole scene that it portrays. And throughout the 2000s, rappers really tried to get permits. They never succeeded. And so Persian rap is still sort of in that limbo. It's extremely popular, but the government really hasn't figured out what to do with it. But just very recently, sort of the last 2-3 years, and I think because of the shock that 2009, the Green Movement and the Green Uprising of 2009 was to the system, they've tried to sort of figure out what to do, right? This is a large segment of the youth and the population. They can't just completely lose that crowd, right? So they've been trying to figure out ways of bringing them in into their own sort of discourse, so to speak. And this is something that we saw, for example, in 2015 with a very popular rapper called Amir Tatalou. In 2015, when the negotiations on Iran's nuclear program were going on, he released this track called Enerji Hasti. And I just want to show you a short segment of it. I mean, as is clear, official bodies were behind this. He's standing on top of a frigate in he says the Persian Gulf, but he's actually in the Caspian, but he's referring to the Persian Gulf because that's an area that's contested. And he's singing an ode to Iranian power and defending its right to nuclear energy. When the New York Times reporter Thomas Erdbrink asked the producer behind this track, which is the producer of in one of the most conservative cultural sort of centers in Iran, why did you guys do this? This is, this guy, Amir Tatalou, is best known for sort of love and party tracks, and he's got these tattooed arms and, has tons of photos of himself with girls. He said, what better way to attract the youth to our ideals than a rapper who subscribes to those? If we hadn't changed, we would have lost our audience. So there's a really active sort of attempt on behalf of certain government bodies to try to co-opt parts of that scene and bring them in. In fact, Tatalou was last seen backing the very conservative candidate Ebrahim Raisi, who ran against the more centrist President Rouhani in 2017, and this was a sort of shocking photograph, right? Raisi is the guardian of Iran's holiest shrine in Mashhad, the shrine of Imam Reza that I mentioned before. So he's not just a very conservative person; he's also he's the guardian of some of the most sort of sacred and religious icons in Iran. And there's Tatalou with his bare arms, which was not accidental. These kinds of things don't happen by accident. So the tattoos in this photograph are really supposed to signal to Tatalou's followers, you can be cool, you can be a rapper, you can have tattoos, and sort of come over to this side of things and support more conservative currents in the Islamic Republic. They've also tried the same thing with rock music. More recently, in the last 2-3 years, a lot of underground rock musicians have received permits. So rock music in some ways has actually gone mainstream now. So the state has managed to a great extent to dismantle the underground music scene, this very vibrant scene, and co-opt a lot of their works. On a parallel track, it's also been supporting content that is ideologically committed to the Islamic Republic, and one of the greater sort of faces of this front is Hamid Zamani. So 2009 was full of sort of iconographic, images, right? Azadi Tower was the center of those protests, people climbing that tower. Azadi means freedom, claiming the Freedom Tower for the Green Movement and so on. Those are some of the images that are being actively co-opted and reclaimed by more conservative forces with great funding. And I want to show you a short segment of that. They're at the base of Azadi Tower. And in a bit, you'll see somebody climbing it. There we go. That's a very powerful image. Okay, the people who are climbing Azadi Tower back then were not doing it for Khamenei. Now, to come back to a question that I posed at the beginning, why is music so important? At its very base, I hope some of these clips showed you, it's important because it's able to reflect and mediate political sentiments in a way that is difficult to control. The meaning of music is created between the producers and what a theorist called Michel de Certeau calls the secondary producers. So you're not just a consumer of something. In the act of consuming, especially in the age of social media and so on, you are reproducing that content by posting it, by projecting certain meanings onto it, and so on. And of course, their music, as you saw with Shajarian, for example, Morgasar, the caged bird, can really invigorate and redefine century-long sort of narratives, right? In an easy way. You hear that song and instantly a whole world of meaning is brought into the presence. And that too makes it very powerful. And of course, there are meanings that this last track tries to negate or co-opt, not this one, but the one that we saw of Azadi Power. So I think I probably have to come to an end, is that correct? I think what we can say for now is that Imam Khomeini's policy of expediency, what I mentioned before, whatever is in the interest of the state, has culminated in this. Considering Iran's huge youth population, the state allows for this entertainment space to exist, but whereas Khomeini's edict was meant to support committed music in the service of the revolution, it now translates into permitting music that is not explicitly against the revolution. And more recently, there has been a parallel track, which these last clips showed you, to co-opt or create committed music that speaks to a younger audience that no longer responds to Islamic ideology, but as that track with the frigate and the song about nuclear energy shows you, but certainly responds to nationalist ideology. Thank you.